One summer day in the early 90s, I had just finished a round of shopping with my grandparents at a Florida flea market, and we decided to take a break at this little lunch counter. The open air kitchen allowed us to see the pizzas and sandwiches being made, and the cook had a very animated style of interacting with customers, like winking at anyone who made eye contact or amusing the children there by dancing to the song Lambada. Shortly before eating my meal, I learned through conversation that Miami's Haitian community, which is where we were shopping, was once an early ground zero of the AIDS epidemic, a fact I couldn't really separate from my appetite. What if the cook was infected? What if the guy had a cut on his finger and HIV-infected blood dripped into the food? What if there was malicious intent to contaminate my grub with the virus? Irregardless of how wild and bizarre these fears sounded, every what if became certainty. Worst part about it was, intellectually, I knew they were unfounded. Unless you decide to eat a raw chimpanzee carcass or soup with fresh blood spilled all over it, there's no proven risk of contracting HIV from food. Every germ needs its own unique environment to survive. Some thrive on the skin, others are only infectious in soil, saliva, or in the air. If AIDS was that easy to get, the human race would have faced extinction long ago. But even when accepting hard facts and science, the what-ifs never cease to be. Gash your arm and a blunt edge outside. You consider the possibility that a diseased heroin addict could have done the same thing before. Touching what appears to be a red spot could be considered transmittable. You might even avoid public restrooms for certain bio breaks. Then, when I was a high school sophomore 20 years ago, the first so-called confirmed exposure finally happened. I ran into a teacher's assistant who was going on retirement to get palliative treatment for final stage AIDS. Our families had known each other for years. I attended kindergarten with his daughter. If we don't cross paths again later in the week, he told me, it was great working with you, and then we both shook hands. That was it. That was the exposure. I studied my palm a few minutes later and noticed a small scrape with a tiny patch of blood. I was much more informed that year, but the intrusive thought pattern still wouldn't vanish. The fact of the matter is that it was never about fear of contracting an incurable illness. It always had to do with turning every worst-case scenario into subconscious reality. That's OCD for you. And it's a double whammy of sorts. Those not familiar with the condition will accuse you of being delusional. If you don't get ridiculed by family members, friends, coworkers, or medical professionals, you'll probably be ignored. Over time, you grow numb to all the humiliation and indifference, and the anxiousness might wear on you to the point of learned helplessness. In the meantime, the thoughts don't stop without some acknowledgement or intervention. So what broke me out of this particular brand of phobias and habits? Well, between 2012 and 2015, I worked as a systems admin at a CLIA lab and gained quite a bit of on-the-job scientific knowledge. I was nowhere near the samples and specimens, but we had everyday contact with the doctors and nurses there. Some were willing to give us free medical advice on the house. One of the physicians had a unique approach in providing his wisdom. He occasionally made you answer your own questions. For instance, I had a case of cracked skin on my knuckles one time, and he told me that this was only caused by a condition that makes someone wash their hands too often. What could that be? The next issue came STDs. I was getting back into dating around that time by way of online websites, a method I never tried before to meet women. It also wasn't the most practical based on the kinds of people who frequent them. But faulty condoms wasn't the only what if. Also came the prospect of violent honey traps or false accusations by a borderline narcissist. Save for a few white liars and weirdos here and there, nothing chaotic really came out of my plenty of fish flings. It did, however, reveal many more anxieties than just fear of catching a bug. Once again, it was about expecting any worst-case scenario without additional forethought. Stick your hand in a hornet's nest, and Vegas odds are quite good you'll get stung. Hit the freeway during rush hour traffic, and while you'll find yourself surrounded by a bunch of reckless drivers, you won't necessarily end up in a car accident or road rage. Could happen and would happen have different ranges of probability. Interestingly enough, a few other employees at my former job shared the same OCD HIV anxiety, which was pretty much alleviated by the affable house doctor. He told us, "I've been to many countries around the world. I've been stuck by my own needles, splashed, and even puked on by patients who had more than just AIDS. Does that mean you're going to be cautious around me too?" He also said he would do his international relief work all over again if asked. The only exception was returning to Sudan because he saw someone there holding an AK-47. This exposed another weak spot in my OCD logic. Among other things, there's many more conditions to worry about than just AIDS. Like I'm sure most of you are familiar with Lou Gehrig's disease, a rare affliction I wouldn't even wish on a worst enemy. You're basically imprisoned in your own body and spend your final days helpless in suffocating pain. In comparison, all HIV does is destroy the body's white blood cells, so you're no longer immune against rare opportunistic infections. Also not a nice condition to have, but not nearly as horrific as being crumpled to death by your own muscles. Believe it or not, there's online communities for people obsessed about getting Lou Gehrig's. Have twitching all over your body that won't go away? Well, it's the kind of discussion that goes on over there. I came real close to going down that same path, in addition to taking repeated STD tests, negative after negative result. And with all the previous fear about cuts and scrapes, why wasn't there the same amount of concern over tetanus, or foodborne botulism when eating? I think what set those conditions apart is that although they're potentially fatal and disfiguring, they're not recurring and lifelong, hence failing the worst-case scenario test. Only when the negative outcome is entirely irreversible, at least in my book. Like the thought process that makes you repeatedly check the locks in your house or car doors before leaving. The compulsive fear that you'll get burglarized and never see some important possessions ever again. Getting ripped off is certainly a reasonable worry, but there's that element of common sense that while unlocked doors make a burglar's job a whole lot easier, they tend to expect a secured latch, which is why they bring their modified tools. And if you have the mental routine of believing you didn't lock your doors, maybe, just maybe, you have the same routine of making sure they're locked, and repeatedly over and over again. When your intelligence is at war with your anxiety, after a while it should become apparent that the latter is all hat and no cattle. A bully that just won't shut up, a monumental waste of time. Speaking of which, many of us on the anxious spectrum often find ourselves romantically linked to someone on the cluster B side. Well, ironically, many of our counterparts suffer from their own form of anxiety, but as opposed to thoughts of apprehension, it's an inferiority complex caused by not getting their wants or needs met. Since compulsive fears and impulsive desires are basically second cousins of each other, it's a match made in relationship hell for sure. Fortunately for those of us on the OCD hypochondriac side, there's ideas we know for a fact are preposterous, like receiving large sums of money in a short amount of time for no reason. While I'm sure everyone wants that to happen, others live with the process of expecting it and then acting out in offensive ways when it doesn't happen. Hence the reason cluster Bs are considered the dramatic forms of personality disorders. Keep in mind that I use money only as an allegory. So the next time you find yourself fearing for the worst, why not counter that with what you know is definitely absurd? Anticipation of the implausible best. When it comes to cognitive behavior therapy, I doubt there's any innovation to this approach, but what sets my technique apart is the larger emphasis on reverse psychology, negation through contrast. After using this strategy, I'd like to let you all in on a little secret I've discovered about myself. The more routine fears you do away with, the less you'll also find yourself drawn to toxic personalities, and them to you. For those still trying to overcome codependent relationships, really think about that, long and hard. If you found this blurb useful, please like, subscribe, comment, share, contribute to my Patreon to keep these videos going, and take it easy.